We've gone war to war, moment to moment, always focused on the present. And all the strategic decisions were made based on the enemies Israel has at the moment. I think Israel's now reaching that point where it has to understand whatever action it takes also affects where it'll be in 100 years. And in 100 years, Turkey may become Israel's best friend. Iran may be Israel's best friend. Israel cannot continue to pay a strategic price for peace treaties. It has to preserve its strategic power for any eventuality coming down the road. And fortunately, I think we are reaching the end of the Iranian regime's days, if played correctly.
Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. We saw beginning over the weekend that suddenly, as soon as the ceasefire essentially went into force, that all hell broke loose in Syria. Suddenly, these rebel factions were taking over Aleppo and now Hama, and what's going on? And there are all these reports. In fact, one of them I thought was credible, so I posted it on my X account. But that Syrian President Bashar Assad was on his way to Moscow, and all kinds of other things going on. So the civil war is back in Syria, and people keep asking, well, is this good or bad for Israel? Is this good or bad for the United States? I think and should we want to be for Assad? Is the devil you know better than the devil you don't know? And those are the sort of questions that are dominating the news in Israel. But, there's a much bigger story here. And the question of who are we for sort of ignores a larger reality, which is that what we're seeing here are tectonic plates of the strategic realities of the strategic landscape of the Middle East shifting as a result of the situation, the massive downgrading of Iran and the Iranian axis by Israel. And just in a nick of time, my colleague and very good friend, Dr. David Wurmser from the Center for Security Policy in Washington and the Coalition Policy Forum, I think, here in Israel, he wrote a very important article, which he sent to me, and even before it was published at JNS and at a number of other places, describing those tectonic shifts. And so as soon as I finished reading it, I contacted David and I said, I need you to be on the show this week so that we can make sense of the situation. So first of all, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Caroline Glick Show, Dave Wurmser. Hey, Dave, thanks for coming.
Oh, it's always a pleasure and an honor. So,
sure. But listen, so your article is titled "Prepare for Disintegration of Syria and the Rise of Imperial Turkey." So first of all, the immediate question is, what is going on? Who's fighting whom in Syria? What are we seeing? What's happening there?
Right. I mean, there's the very granular level, in which case you'd get lost in the spaghetti. But on the national level, or that region of the Middle East, or that portion of the Middle East, looking at it strategically, basically there are three forces at work. One is, of course, the Iran-Russian axis that includes Syria and Hezbollah. And they're fighting for the survival of the Syrian regime and its use as a logistics structure to continue to wage war on Israel and keep the Ring of Fire alive in some capacity, both as an aggressive tool to choke and kill Israel, but also as a defensive structure to try to deter Israel from striking Iran. Against them now rises the Turkish grouping, which includes Turkey, Turkic forces, and also Turkey has been very aggressively in the last half decade or more cultivating the various remnants of Islamist organizations across across Iraq and Syria. When the United States pulled out of northern Syria a few years ago, it opened the door for Turkey to free the prisoners who were ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And they organized them into various bands that then somewhat were sent to Libya to fight the pro-Egyptian Haftar forces, and the others were organized into these forces in Syria. So you're seeing the second grouping is the Turkish-Islamist grouping. And then the third is collections of others, the Kurds who are just orphaned here. Absent really is the United States, and that's part of the story. And the second thing that I think is part of the story is that Turkey is an issue and a player largely because this was the unnoticed failure, in my view, of the Obama administration, where we subcontracted the opposition to the Syrian regime in Syria to Turkey.
Let me just back up a second, because we haven't talked about Syria and the Syrian civil war and the Turkish involvement versus the Iranian involvement, America, Kurds all mixed into for many years. And so it's important to just go back for a second. So the Syrian civil war began, if I'm not mistaken, around 2011. And initially there was I think it was called the Free Syrian Army, and they were good guys or kind of good guys, and then they got taken over, and then there was the al-Nusra that were kind of al-Qaeda, kind of good guys, and so everybody was sort of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You had the Kurds who were fighting with the United States against ISIS, and then they were invaded by Turkey, I remember, somewhere around in Idlib around, 2018 or so. But you still have the Kurdish forces in Syria that are aligned with the PKK Kurds in Syria, in Turkey or not. But so you're saying basically, just so I understand, you have the Iranian axis, which includes the Assad regime and Russia and Hezbollah, and they're being attacked right now by the Turkish axis that includes these Islamist groups that have been operating under the Turkish umbrella for well nigh 10 years or so, since America began quitting Iraq and just walking away from the whole thing or failing to act in a coherent fashion under the Obama administration. And then you have the Americans that are there too, and they're kind of just watching everything, not clear what's going on. And you have the Kurds that are sort of, I don't know, are they lost? Are they in trouble? Are they doing okay? I mean, so if you just sort of, say it for people who can't remember anything,
Yeah, no, I think you described it perfectly. I think the Kurds are orphaned. They have no patron right now because the United States was essentially their patron, and the United States has largely been AWOL in the region for the last few years. So the Kurds are, and what you're seeing is as the Iran-Russian axis is at war with the Turkish-Islamist axis, both of those are also attacking the Kurds and the remnants of the more pro-American forces, the Free Syrian Army and so forth. So essentially those who sided with America are paying the heaviest price right now. And the rest are basically engaged in a tectonic strategic battle, really geostrategic battle between the Iran-Russia axis and the Turkish-Islamist axis, which is beginning to drag in the Chinese too.
So wait, before you get into the wider geopolitical thing, so your basic contention in the article, if I read it correctly, is that, okay, so Israel has severely, massively downgraded the Ring of Fire, the Shiite arc that, as King Abdullah referred to it back in 2003, that stretched from Iran through Iraq into Syria, Lebanon, and then through the Palestinian areas into Gaza, and then down the Red Sea to the Houthis. So that this was sort of the Iranian empire. And many of the key actors in this arc of Shiism, this Hamas, even the Houthis with their port that was attacked and destroyed by Israel, and of course Hezbollah in Lebanon, they've been massively degraded. Their war-making power has been degraded, and of course Iran itself has been humiliated and hopefully is on the way to being denied its nuclear installations in the very near future. So this axis that seemed invincible a year and a half ago has now been severely weakened. And in the wake of this weakening, we see a rise of a new force that we haven't been paying too much of attention to, that is a strategic force, that is a regional force, that is under the aegis of an ascendant neo-Ottoman Turkish regime under Erdogan. Is that basically is the main claim that you make in this article?
That's correct. That's correct.
Now
they're
there's
beginning to make. They're making their move, and the weakness. They're exploiting the weakness that has been inflicted on the Russian-Iranian axis, as you mentioned, and they're making their move using the Islamist forces. What is interesting in this one is that Egypt is, which we had counted on being anti-Turkish, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, not anti-Turkish, really anti-Muslim Brotherhood, which Erdogan is the leader of, anti-Islamist, suddenly seems, and nobody's noticed, seems to have made its peace with Erdogan over the last 5 to 7 years. The first manifestation of that was to tolerate not a little bit of smuggling into Gaza to Hamas's control, because Hamas had been Egypt's nemesis as well. But suddenly, Egypt became the major conduit with massive smuggling into Gaza, really to the point of being a strategic problem, because Hamas therefore could become the army that launched October 7th, largely because of Egyptian cooperation with Hamas. And that already suggested that they had switched sides on some level, because before that, Hamas was no less of a threat to Egypt internally with the Muslim Brotherhood as it was to Israel. The second thing to show it is the behavior since then of trying to protect the lifelines to Hamas and save Hamas, along with Qatar's efforts. But Egypt stepped up too and has tried to save Hamas. And then, again, unnoticed completely, it was a few days ago, the Egyptians released 800 Muslim Brotherhood prisoners in Egypt. This is not a goodwill gesture. This is the manifestation of a strategic statement. And the strategic statement is that Egypt has read the map. It has read the map that Iran is going down. It has read the map that the United States is not their friend. And they're switching sides, and they see Turkey as emerging as a significant power. And they can't fight it anymore in Libya. They can't fight it internally with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're doing the usual Middle East thing. They're trying to co-opt it and try to harness it or to join it. And that's what you're seeing with Egypt. So this Turkish threat is beginning to acquire much more vast dimensions than what we had been accustomed to over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, the weakness now that the United States shows, and the indulgence of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist politics that the United States has shown over the last 20 years is coming to bear fruit. In fact, the entire foreign policy structure of the United States, whether it's appeasing the Islamists, whether it's appeasing Iran, this is really now coming to fruition and leading to a catastrophic strategic situation.
Well, what you're describing is a nightmare for Israel because, of course, under the peace deal with Israel that they signed in 1979, they've developed a military force that it's much more powerful than the force that Israel was hard-pressed to beat back based on Soviet military platforms in 1973. Moreover, because at the outset of the Sisi years in office, after he ousted the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013, he was fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, he was fighting Hamas, he was fighting ISIS. Israel effectively allowed him to breach the binding parts of the peace agreement, which included, most importantly, the demilitarization of the Sinai Peninsula. And today, that is not the case. You have Egyptian armored divisions at the border with Gaza. along the Philadelphia corridor, something that was never envisioned in 1979 when Israel signed the peace treaty. We allowed them to do that because they were fighting a war that we supported against ISIS terrorists in the Sinai and Hamas and other Muslim Brotherhood-aligned terrorists in the Sinai. And now we're in this situation where, due to Sisi's, we thought permanent, but obviously it's become temporary move. We have a nightmare specter of a militarized Sinai, an armed to the teeth with sophisticated weapons, trained by the United States, and in cooperation with China, among other things, Egypt. So first of all, talk to me. This is something that Israel has to think about very seriously, because Egypt is a much larger threat from a military perspective if it chooses to go to war against Israel than anything that we faced in the past year and a half or year and a month of war on 7 fronts that is directed by Iran, except for perhaps the Iranian nuclear program. What happened? Talk to me about the missteps that the United States has taken that led to the situation where Sisi, who was clearly in the American column along with the Saudis and the UAE, has suddenly moved to the Turkic column with Erdogan and threatens all of the critical interests of the United States and, of course, Israel and the very survival of Israel. What has happened?
Well, the Egypt thing, I think, exposes the 2 critical failures of the Obama administration. The first was you treat your friends better than your enemies. They did the inverse. They punished and threatened their friends to try to appease their enemies. Again, I'm not sure they even saw the enemies as the enemies and the friends as the friends. So I think they looked at Iran as a potential partner and Israel as a problem and maybe even a threat to their grand vision. And the same thing with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We were very negative and nasty to Egypt over the Muslim Brotherhood issue and constantly bashed them over the head. And then we also abandoned them in critical strategic areas like Libya. And they started already drifting toward Russia because of that. But now with Russia being weaker and bogged down and the Ukraine, Russia less and less of a shiny object to hold on to. So I think that's one critical failure. And the second critical failure was understanding that, unlike the UAE and some of the others who made the Abraham Accords for a different set of reasons, and we can get into that, but Egypt made peace because it banked on the rise of the American world over the Soviet world in the 70s. And peace with Israel was a down payment to joining the club of the West. And therefore, if Egypt strategically believes the West is in decline and that other forces are rising, the down payment they made to be part of the club of the West, namely peace with Israel, is no longer valuable. So the peace with Israel begins to fray and come under great stress because the Egyptians don't value it anymore. They never saw it as the strong horse argument, and Israel being the strong horse that's worth having as an ally. It was they wanted to be part of the club of the West, and if now they don't, then that peace means nothing to them in that sense.
I think it's important to pause for a second, because from an American perspective, every time that a country has left the Soviets and gone to the Americans or opened up to the United States in a way that they hadn't in the past, it was always attributed to some sort of a change of heart. That, it's because they've decided that they want to open themselves up to Western values, or they're becoming a more open society. And I think that the Egyptian example that you point out here is proof that the exact opposite is the case. That it didn't come into Sadat's thinking at all. I mean, he was looking at it from a pure power perspective. The United States was the ascendant power. He believed that they were going to beat the Soviets in the Cold War, that their weapons were better than the Soviet weapons. He wanted to be on that side and not on the Soviet side. So it wasn't that he changed his aspirations for Egypt, or the values, or whatever you want to call them, that he held on to, that he believed in. But it wasn't an ideological shift. It was a pragmatic shift based on power calculus and the national interests of Egypt as he assessed it to be.
Correct, and that's exactly correct. I don't believe Sadat, even as much as he was, I think, a great leader, I don't think he became a Zionist overnight, and I don't think he valued Israel as the resurrection of ancient Jewish civilization or anything like that. It was a strategic, dispassionate strategic move, which also implies, by the way, the anti-Zionism is often just a dispassionate strategic move, and we need not always to take that as the bottom line and say, oh, we can't ever, Israel has to give in because without it, they'll never come to terms with Israel. The truth is they'll never come to terms with Israel one way or the other. It's a question of power and strength and respect for Israel as a regional force and their self-interest. And that's what really drives the peace in the Middle East. I remember Fouad Ajami on page 2 of his book, The Arab Predicament, he already said right off, he said it about Lebanon, but it really applies to the entire Middle East. And his book was about the whole Middle East, The Arab Predicament, was that in Lebanon, luxury principles are luxuries. And I think understanding the Middle East, one really has to understand that identities change, principles change radically based on self-interest. And you can't bank on them. You can't think that you're Luxembourg and all of a sudden the spirit of the age has led France and Germany to treat you as a normal little country that has every rights and respects that Germany and France do. In the Middle East, it isn't like that.
And here I think it's you mentioned something else which I think is also key, because we've seen Egypt going and buying Russian weapons, buying Chinese weapons, and it makes the Americans sort of raise an eyebrow, but they haven't done anything. They haven't rethought their view of Egypt as a result of those actions. And then, as you said, Israel's rude awakening about Egypt came on October 7th, on October 8th, when we asked, where the hell did all these weapons come from? This is ridiculous. We had no idea that they had this many. So yes, it's true. Our intelligence was horrible, but it was also that we were blinded by a delusion that Egypt was credible, that they were trustworthy. And then suddenly we saw this harsh animosity that they wouldn't allow the Gazans to leave to seek shelter in Rafah on the Egyptian side of the border. They wouldn't allow them to transit Egypt to third countries. All of this is, of course, in abrogation of international law, or breach of international law. But the thing is that that was Israel's rude awakening. But you also mentioned in your article the U.S.'s the Biden administration's refusal to end the Houthis' effective blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb of the Suez Canal that has, been devastating for the Egyptian economy as sort of the straw that broke the camel's back from the Egyptian perspective. Can you go a little bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, we were on one side, we were increasingly holding aid above Egypt's head as the sword of Damocles to engage in political appeasement of the Muslim Brotherhood, which threatened the regime of Egypt. And then on the other hand, we failed to uphold really the most essential obligation we have in the Middle East, which is to keep the waterways open, to keep the Suez Canal open, and to keep the Red Sea, the high seas, essentially free navigation. This has been an American mission since the very beginning of America. I mean, that's the reason why we have a blue water fleet, and it's why in the U.S. Constitution there's a differentiation made between maintaining a navy and raising an army. So that implies already a strategic outlook that the United States sees the high seas as its essential national purpose. And it failed. And Egypt reads that and says the Americans are gone. The Americans are at best a nuisance. at worst, the strategic weakening element for Egypt. And they're not there to provide any positive benefit anymore other than the continued flow of aid, which they'll keep taking as long as it's offered. But there's no strategic anchoring to the United States anymore that comes with that, because the United States has removed itself from the region effectively as a credible and respected force. So Egypt really has read that. And they're looking at China and they're looking at Russia. And they're also extrapolating it in a far broader sense to say globally that the BRICS countries, the Brazil, Russia, BRICS, India, China, and South Africa, et cetera, are the new superpower, and that their GNP has surpassed the Americas. By the way, it's something Putin always says. He said it at the Valdai conference on October 5th, 2023, 2 days before October 7th, saying the world is shifting. The BRICS are now the new superpower, and we've surpassed the West in terms of economic power. So all this stuff of, oh, well, you want to side with them, they're losers, they're economically going down. No, if you force them to choose, countries like Egypt may choose the BRICS, and apparently that's what's happened.
Well, first of all, I think we have to go back, because I want to go to you to the larger strategic issues of what is America now going into the Trump administration supposed to do vis-a-vis Egypt, vis-a-vis Turkey, and Israel's strategic positioning going forward. But I also want to talk to you first. We do have unfinished business. I mean, even now you have this, and I guess we also have to talk about the remaining 50 days of the Biden administration, because they are acting really as agents of chaos here in the region. I just saw this afternoon that the Americans are now accusing Israel of breaching the ceasefire with Hezbollah, which is it's insane. I mean, it's just a bald-faced act of aggression against Israel. The ceasefire, such as it is, permits Israel to have drone flights, have overflights, attack Hezbollah's forces as they're coming into the South Lebanon, et cetera. And here is America under the Biden administration, 2 days after he gets himself photographed holding Rashid Khalidi's book saying that Israel has no right to exist, coming in and saying that Israel is breaching the ceasefire. So we have this interregnum that, the Americans are causing no end of grief to Israel first and foremost, but to other spurned allies with this kind of behavior. And second of all, we haven't taken out Iran's nuclear installations. They're still there. I mean, Israel attacked and defeated and destroyed, I think, the S-300s, or most of them, the anti-aircraft batteries that Russia had given to Iran or sold to Iran over the years. But obviously, I mean, this is a dynamic situation, and they can get new ones. And, time is of the essence in this as well. So first speak to the interregnum where we are now, the 50 days left of this Biden administration, which, I mean, there are contradictory reports if they want to give nukes to Ukraine. I mean, they're just they're acting in a shocking way, all over the world, but particularly here in this part of the world.
There's an element of scorched earth that seems to be obtaining with this administration right now in the Middle East. Again, I think it goes back to the Obama administration and Biden administration. They look at Israel not as a friend. And as a result, I think they're trying to get their last licks in, trying to bring down the Netanyahu government and trying to strategically weaken Israel. So my sense is these accusations of violating the ceasefire, and it's in black and white, Israel has the right to overfly. In fact, there was a great deal done about the fact that Israel can overfly, but it can't go supersonic. It can't have sonic booms because that's threatening, right? Well, these drones, believe me, are not supersonic, and they're flying. The very limit on Israel not to fly supersonic shows you that the Americans fully understood Israel was going to overfly Lebanon. And the ceasefire, of course, is useless for Israel and would never have signed it had it not maintained its overflight rights. So the United States is literally calling it a violation when it is actually Israel fulfilling the the ceasefire agreement. And what this tells me is the United States is seeking an excuse again to deny Israel the weapons. So the key takeaway for Israel, which is opening the spigot on the embargoed weapons, I bet will remain shut now. And second of all, Israel's in a much worse diplomatic position, even though it gave in and it literally allowed its victory to be surrendered for a ceasefire. So on the strategic side, I think the United States, as Biden recedes into the sunset, and I don't think he's even in control. I doubt the book he held in his hand by Rashid Khalidi, he even knew what it was or that he even reads. I think this was a prop intentionally set up to send a signal, the way Obama used to do it all the time. He used to hold a book in his hand that sort of signaled where his policy was headed. And not that I think Obama read it either, but it was the signal. And so I think he's out strategically, not he, but his staff who's in control is out to get their final attempt to bring down Netanyahu and to weaken Israel and paralyze Israel going into the new administration.
So what's Israel?
On the strategic.
What's Israel?
Well, I think Israel's
50 days.
Well, I think what Israel's move here is that it has to therefore start engaging in the sort of strategic activity that it had to have engaged in all along, which is to decisively deal with the Iranian threat and to essentially resume, in my view, if the United States makes unworkable the ceasefire, then the ceasefire needs to go away. Israel has a real danger of losing the Galilee. It has the real danger of losing the war against Hezbollah if it is not able to implement and strongly adhere and force the Lebanese to adhere to the terms of the ceasefire. If that does not happen, even if it does, it's somewhat questionable for Israel. But even if it doesn't happen, then this ceasefire has done nothing but hand Hezbollah a victory over Israel. And Israel can't live with that after October 7th. So I think Israel has no choice but to resume fire and to finish the war that it couldn't finish under. If that's
So
really what the
that
administration.
scenario for January 19th, 20th, 21st, but we have over 40 days until then. So the question is, how do we? I mean, what they're trying to do, as you said, is overthrow the government of Israel in this interregnum. They're trying to seize defeat from the jaws of victory with a ceasefire and with some sort of a deal for the hostages that's going to require Israel to lose the war to Hamas in Gaza as well. So I mean, how do we survive this interregnum? Because and I guess the play that you're talking about most immediately is, okay, go after Iran's nuclear installations. Is that basically what the play is right now, given the strategic?
Well, I think nuclear installations. Well, I think nuclear installations in oil. We must not take oil off the table because that's what threatens the regime, and it's also the funding spigot for the entire structure that you have with Hezbollah in Syria. And so therefore, I think the deal's off with the United States under the Biden administration. If they cannot do the minimum to accord to Israel's strategic requirements, and Israel has done so much to punt to the United States and has lost a lot of soldiers and probably a lot of hostages because of this administration. I know that's a harsh accusation, but I am sure there would be, at the end of this, more live hostages and more live Israeli soldiers had the Biden administration not constantly tripped Israel up along the way at every turn and every corner. And as a result, I think Israel no longer has much of an obligation to restrain itself in pursuing its vital strategic interests for survival. And specifically, I think what's happening with the Turks is driving home how urgent it is to essentially terminate the Iranian axis threat. Israel has to move to completely paralyze and hopefully, I hope, bring down the regime and set the stage as quickly as possible for the collapse of the regime in Iran. Because strategically, first of all, it needs to deny the regime the ability to fund. If America won't let Israel implement the deal kinetically by hitting in Syria, hitting the transfers, hitting Hezbollah, and continuing to weaken Hezbollah's threat to Israel, then Israel has to turn the funding spigot off. And also to keep Iran in despair, and it's one of its last acts to turn nuclear. So Israel has to hit the nuclear, and it has to go after the oil, and hopefully has to start destabilizing the regime to the point where it really is threatened with collapse. Then on the larger strategic level, Israel really, this is analogous to World War II. The destruction of the Nazi regime was a requirement prior to our ability to engage the Soviet threat. We couldn't come to terms or allow to linger the Nazi regime and turn our attention to the Soviet Union in 1945. Israel has to deal with this threat of Iran first and foremost and bring it to a final terminal conclusion so that it can begin to prepare itself for the longer-term strategic threat emerging under this Islamist, Turkish-led coalition that might have Chinese buy-in and Egyptian participation. Israel really has to get ready for that, and it can't linger waiting around for the eventual collapse of an Iranian regime that is refunded and reinvigorated by the final days of the
Biden administration.
Yeah.
The Obama-Biden administration. I think you're right. I think in terms of Lebanon, we do have a problem even more than we have a problem with Iran, which is that I think my assessment and it's probably based on my conversations with me, myself, and I, but all the same. It seems fairly clear from the leaks in the media, from the prime minister and down, that the Biden administration wasn't offering us a deal of keep fighting or get to the ceasefire. The deal what was hanging in the balance was either you do this deal with us, which, as you show, the Americans themselves are in breach of by claiming that we're in breach of a deal that we're not in breach of, as a means to continue their embargo of arms against us. But also that the other alternative was that they were going to pass a binding ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council that was also going to then bind us under a Trump administration that wasn't going to be able to cancel it. So that it was a terrible option or an impossible one, and so we chose the terrible one to avoid the impossible one. And so I think that the play that you're talking about, that you're describing in terms of going after, just stopping with this nonsense and going after the head of the octopus rather than, just the body of the octopus, the legs of the octopus. I think that's really the play that we've come to as a result of the Biden administration's aggressive hostility towards Israel. And now I just want to move for a second to the future, to the Trump administration. I've spoken to many Republican lawmakers over the past year, and one of the things that I raised with them was Egypt's changing role, changing position in the region, which became, as I said, shockingly apparent to Israelis after October 7th. And there was really nobody to talk. There was very little openness to discussing the shifting reality of Egypt's strategic position and the fact that the United States were going to have to contend with this. But if you were to be in an ideal situation where Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio and other top administration officials, Mike Waltz, the designated national security advisor, and their top advisors, if they were open to discussing it, what would you tell them vis-a-vis Egypt, which obviously has an active diplomatic presence in Washington, a very powerful one, and has long been viewed as a stable ally or American client state, and now it's shifting. What would you say to them in that regard?
Well, what I would tell them, first of all, is Egypt's playing you. It's beginning to see how successful Qatar was in playing everybody, and they're playing everybody now too, and that they need to essentially lay down the law to Egypt and say, are you with us or are you against us? And if you're with us, then let's see you behave that way. And that has certain implications. Let's see you work effectively with Israel to ensure Gaza never becomes a Hamasistan again. Let's see you work with us to ensure that the Islamist threat regionally is checked, and so on and so forth. And let's also make sure that you come back into full compliance with the Camp David peace treaty that you have with Israel, that the remilitarization of the Sinai doesn't make any sense now that Hamas is essentially destroyed. And if you're serious about ensuring that Hamas doesn't resurrect as an Islamist force, or that some other force surrounding the Turks like Al-Qaeda remnants and so forth doesn't arise in Gaza, if you're serious about that, then you don't need to remilitarize the Sinai, because Israel will essentially take care of that problem for you. So there's no reason for Egypt to remilitarize the Sinai. So I would first of all lay down the law to the Egyptians and say those are the essential things. What's happening internally in Egypt, we're not going to interfere in that much. We're not as involved in democracy effort as we used to be, and we certainly don't want to throw away our allies because of that at this stage. Recognizing that the region is not quite there yet in terms of political development. So essentially, we have to tell the Egyptians, you've got to choose. And if they don't, well, there's consequences. They may choose not to side with us, in which case then we have to have a very serious reexamination. By the way, this also applies to the Gulf states. I think what this war since October 7th showed us is, I'm a great fan of the Abraham Accords, but I think this also showed us the limits of the Abraham Accords. It is not a military structure that really, really strongly enhances Israel's security. I think it's a tremendous economic structure. It is a strategic structure. If you have, for example, the IMEC, the Middle East transit corridor that people talk about, going to replace the Suez Canal, a land bridge between Asia
or
and
just augment it. You don't have to be replacing it.
Right. I mean, you have essentially, and you obviously, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others are going to be very important to challenging the spread of Turkish-Islamist power. This has also been their nemesis, as has Iran. But what we've noticed is that they're not really going to step up into the forefront and help Israel in a really significant way. So I think the real strategic play for Israel, again, goes back to Iran. It has to be removed as a threat entirely, and potentially even harness as an answer, a strategic partner in a post-Ayatollah world. So the urgency of Israel moving beyond, Iran is huge at this point. And getting the Iranian regime out of the way so that Israel can start dealing with the Iranians as a partner. Again, and by the way, that's the big play now. I think it's a bigger play than trying to expand the Abraham Accords into Saudi Arabia and to harness Saudi Arabia at great price to Israel. Israel cannot continue to pay a strategic price for peace treaties. It has to preserve its strategic power for any eventuality coming down the road. And fortunately, I think we are reaching the end of the Iranian regime's days, if played correctly. That is a far bigger strategic gain for Israel, and frankly, a bigger peace treaty for Israel than at this point the expansion of the Abraham Accords. If they want to do it, great. And I'm all for it. It has advantages. But I don't think Israel should pay a very high price for this.
I agree. And I would add to that, if Israel goes forward and does what we need to do in terms of instigating the overthrow of the Iranian regime by taking out their nuclear installations, taking away that safety blanket from them, and also paralyzing their ability to export oil in one way or another, I think that and the regime, as a consequence of these and other actions, falls, then suddenly the Saudi Arabians are going to lower their price for peace with Israel to essentially zero, because their own leverage in the region when you have a post-Khomeineist Iran is going to be vastly diminished, at least vis-a-vis Israel and the United States. So I think that's a key insight that you made in previous conversations that we've had. And it was not as central to the argument that you made in the article, but it's a key insight that I think it's worth sharing. And I just want to go back for a second to Turkey and ask you what America should be looking at. I mean, Turkey is a member of NATO, and here they are, the rising state sponsor of Islamic terrorism and jihad. In the event that Israel does in fact step up and leads and takes actions that lead to the precipitation of the fall of the Iranian regime, how is the United States supposed to be looking at Turkey? I mean, obviously it's been a problem for a very long time, but now it would become much more acute. Or it is becoming more acute.
Turkey is a part of NATO, and unfortunately, the structures of NATO don't really allow for the removal of a NATO member by other NATO members. The only way to do it is the NATO member itself, that is Turkey, announces it's leaving, and I think there's a year period where it has to disengage. They have to isolate Turkey, though. They can operationally and functionally behave a certain way, which is to essentially remove Turkey from all the military committees and stop military cooperation and so forth, and essentially ostracize Turkey. I think it's critical.
You have the United States, they have critical bases at Incirlik and other places in Turkey. I mean, it would be very difficult as a practical matter for the United States to disengage.
Well, again, I think we have to really examine our strategic basing. It's a Cold War-based structure. Incirlik is obviously important for many reasons, but we also have issues that now we can do that we didn't have before. Incirlik was very important to have access to the Soviet Union and so forth during the Cold War. But right now, look, we've got Israel and the Saudis, even if there's no peace yet, and UAE all cooperating and allowing American CENTCOM to operate seamlessly in that theater. So we have a military structure we can use on top of it all. Again, if we urgently move toward the removal of the Iranian regime, I can assure you that the Iranians will want to come to terms with the United States, and there'll be strategic concessions that Iran will make to the United States. Like they say,
back for Turkey, then what would do?
Turkey at this point? I think we have to understand Turkey has defined itself as a problem for us. It is threatening other NATO countries, and I'm not talking only about Cyprus. I'm talking about Greece. It is behaving in an imperial way. It is one of the few nations where its foreign minister openly talks with bravado about resurrecting an empire. I mean, even Russia is smart enough to not say that it is imperial. It just acts that way, but it doesn't say it's imperial. The Turks are openly in your face saying, we are imperial. We are neo-Ottoman. You have the Vitoyu and so forth. Their foreign minister said it straight out. Erdogan behaves that way, and they constantly publish maps in their government mouthpiece journals that show maps, these expansive maps of the region and resurrecting the Ottoman Empire and so forth. This is a threat, and just because they're part of NATO should not blind us to that. And also, by the way, in Europe, it's a similar threat. They are funding these Islamist organizations in Europe. There's the Freedom and Justice Party, basically the Justice Party rubric that Erdogan operates. He's created clones across Europe, and he's created two structures for that. One is the Turkish expatriates. He's caught outright sort of Turkish branches of his Muslim Brotherhood party. And then in the rest of the area, he's galvanized non-Turkish Muslims into Muslim Brotherhood structures aligned with Turkey. He is a major reason why the European continent now is facing such violence from its Islamist elements. He is acting strategically as Europe's enemy by being inside the house.
Oh my. So, right. Look, we have to have another conversation. We don't have a lot of time left in our conversation today. So I mean, the United States essentially has to isolate Turkey within NATO, and it has to minimize its own footprint and dependence on Turkey going forward. And there are a number of other steps that it can take forward. But looking at Israel, we've never been good at strategic planning in Israel. It's always been sort of by the skin of, by the skin of our, what do they say? By the
skin of its teeth. Yeah.
Yeah, by the skin of our teeth. That's how we've been moving forward. I'm losing my idiomatic English. It's terrible. But but how is Israel supposed to look at this situation? And we've talked about the need to absolutely move forward quickly, if possible, well before the 20th of January against Iran. Use the fact that the United States has blocked us from winning on the battlefield of Lebanon, and just go to the top and kill the king in Iran. So how do we look at this strategic environment? You set out in your article the way that the plates are shifting, that as Iran recedes, Turkey rises up and it's taking over the remnants of Hamas, and it will rebuild them, ISIS, all the rest of these Sunni Islamist organizations, and is organizing itself with Egypt, Israel's largest strategic threat, the one that we know, it's like Voldemort, nobody wants to mention it. But how is Israel supposed to position itself now? We all want to get past this war, but how are we supposed to look at this from 30,000 feet? What do we do?
Well, the removal of Iran exposes the process of removing Iran is exposing that Syria isn't a country, and the whole Sykes-Picot structure is really up in the air. Sykes-Picot structure being the definition of borders and creation of states along fairly arbitrary lines
in the former Ottoman provinces.
But when you look below the lid, what you see is Israel's not entirely alone. You have Christians, Maronites in the region. You have, and some are still kind of trying to save themselves by playing the Arab nationalist game, like the Greek Orthodox. The Maronites, I think, are beginning to realize they have no hope anymore appeasing Arab nationalism. They're retreating into this idea of we are the Christian Israel,
and like the Assyrians,
and like the Assyrians, and so what you may see is a large refugee flow of Christians into Lebanon, and the Greek Orthodox finally joining their Maronite brothers into realizing their strategic survival. Their survival really depends on a strong Israel to their south, and a sort of an alliance. You're seeing others, Kurds and Druze, seeing that as well. So Israel's not entirely alone, but what it means is that Israel needs to ensure that its strategic environment in the long run is, first of all, an Alawite regime in Syria. If it falls, you could see the Alawites retreat to the coast by Latakia in northwestern Syria, and it can become an Alawite enclave that the Russians are protecting, but that's not viable with the weakening of Russia and without Iran. So ironically, you may even see Russia turn to Israel and ask for some strategic help in at least tolerating it or weakening some of their enemies. So I think that Israel has to ensure that it doesn't lock itself into any of these strategic structures, like constantly being at war. The United States is moving probably for some sort of an accommodation with Russia. Israel will never be pro-Russia, and Russia will never be pro-Israel. But Israel can come up with some livable accommodation again with Russia, perhaps. We'll see. I don't know. But nothing should be taken off the table. The most important thing for Israel now to remember, I think, is, okay, we've gone war to war, moment to moment, always focused on the present. And all the strategic decisions were made based on the enemies Israel has at the moment. I think Israel's now reaching that point where it has to understand whatever action it takes also affects where it'll be in 100 years. And in 100 years, Turkey may become Israel's best friend. Iran may be Israel's best friend. I don't know what else will happen. The bottom line is Israel has to think more systematically about its essential defensible borders and its essential defensible strategic area. By area, I mean areas that are under the Israeli strategic umbrella, but are not directly militarily controlled as part of Israel. And for example, the Sinai Peninsula, I'm not saying Israel has to control the Sinai Peninsula, but it has to remain a buffer, demilitarized buffer. The front defense line of Israel is actually the Suez Canal. And a peace treaty, whatever, is fine as long as it enshrines that being a buffer. Similarly with Lebanon, if you see a Christian nation arise in Lebanon, it is essential that that nation aligns itself with Israel, and therefore Israel eliminates the threats from the north. And there may be geographies in parts of Lebanon that may be essential even to control, like like some of the visual areas. But look, and then elsewhere in Syria, the borders don't mean that much anymore. That's the problem in a lot of these countries. The destabilization that's happened is leading to a complete collapse, and everybody is scrambling now for I don't blame the Turks. They're now scrambling for their strategic vision, and they're acting on it. The Iranians always have, the Russians are, and so forth. Israel has to think in those terms now. It can't think, oh, Iran's gone, we're at peace, we don't have to think strategically. Or, okay, we have to think strategically about Turkey, but then once we get beyond Turkey, we can get up, we can do this, we can do that.
So what you're actually saying, and I think it's true, is that when Israel looks at this shifting environment and rising new threats as current ones recede, thanks to the actions of our military and what still has to be done, that we have to just stop for a second and say, okay, what are our essential strategic needs? What are our requirements? How do we go about securing them? What are the tools that we need at home in terms of our armaments industries and the size of our army and other things? And also, how do we project our power going out in order to secure these areas of that are strategically crucial for Israel, whether they're under our direct control and permanently, or whether they're part of a sort of a strategic cordon that Israel needs to have demilitarized or otherwise pacified on our behalf by others. But that's basically what you are suggesting to Israel. Right now, you have to take inventory and stock what it is that you need, and then how do you go about achieving that and securing those interests for going forward?
Right. And there's two principles that have to guide that. The first one is the one we say in Passover every year, that there will always be another enemy that rises that seeks to destroy us. And that's, by the way, something the United States understands about itself, that when it set up its strategic vision in the 1790s to 1800, it was thinking about Britain, but it never went to war. Well, 1812, but Britain was not the enemy after 1812. And neither was Spain, which is the other thing they were thinking about. Eventually, that same strategic condition led to fighting Japan and Russia in the Cold War, and Germany, powers that weren't even in existence in a viable way for the United States in 1793. So at the end of the day, Israel has to think in those terms, those two principles. And when you do...
So wait, you said the first principle was that in every generation, somebody is going to try to destroy us. What was the second principle?
Yeah, the first principle is that in every generation, somebody will destroy us, and that war is not an aberrant of human behavior anywhere. This idea that there will reach a point of peace and everybody will live peaceably is a utopian vision that has been proven again and again and again to be flawed. And the second one is that Israel therefore has to understand that the strategic alignments and conditions and circumstance, topography, and organization has to be oriented both toward its own society as a democracy, but also geographically, topographically, and so forth, to deal with any strategic threat from any factor, any area that arises coming against it. And since it's a democracy, it will always have mobilization. It will always be mostly about the business of doing business and not being a professional Sparta. So right. It will always need buffers. It will always need buffers that absorb the first strike, that tell the Israelis you are in a state of danger. So Israel needs to organize its
those buffers
around that concept.
Right. And those buffers, for instance, cannot be Kfar Aza and Sderot and Avivim and Kiryat Shmona. That's the whole point. That's what we did learn.
In fact, it shows it shows that what is in the mandatory borders of Israel is one strategic unit that has to be under Israel's positive control. The moment that there's contiguity between Qalqilia and Tehran, or Qalqilia and Cairo, or Azda, Kfar Azda, or Bet Hanina, or whatever, Bet Lahia and Cairo, then you have brought the strategic threat into Tel Aviv and into the heartland, and basically left Israel with no buffer, no mobilization, and you get another October 7th on steroids, or worse, a destruction. So the buffers, so first of all, positive control of at least the mandatory borders. I would say there are some areas beyond that. And then more importantly, also a clear understanding that strategic buffers are essential. Ben-Gurion understood it. It has not really been Israeli strategy since that, like the Sinai really must remain demilitarized.
Or must become again demilitarized because it's been militarized.
Right. Exactly. But if it is the first sign of a strategic threat emerging that requires a response, and that Israel is again out to lunch on the strategic threat from Egypt and allows it to remilitarize. That's again, this is violating the fundamentals of strategy. And again, Israel will face a dangerous situation because of it. Israel must now think seriously about its buffer zones and areas it needs positive control over. Not the same, but in that way, it sets itself up for the 100-year future, 200-year future, which is proper for a state like Israel to think about.
All right. Well, I appreciate that very much. I think that your article was an eye-opener, and it was also very thought-provoking. And it certainly, I think, it came to bear in this discussion and in future ones that we'll have, and that hopefully people in other places in Jerusalem and in Washington will be having in the weeks and months and years to come. Because, as you said, one war doesn't lead to peace; it leads to a new topography of threats in a region that is so critical to global security. And of course, to the survival of the Jewish people. And we have to be aware of those shifting tectonic plates so that we can prepare for them. And the first place to do that is to take stock and see what it is we need in order to survive in shifting environments. So, David, you're brilliant, as always, and it's great to have you on the show and to have you as my friend and my colleague. I feel very privileged. So thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you again soon.